Debate about Woodrow Wilson has raged since the war and still does today. Who was he? A brilliant statesman? Just another racist? Both? Neither? It's been said that anyone who followed Wilson down a political path was almost certain to meet him coming the opposite direction. So let's take a look at Woodrow Wilson. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to our Great War Bio series of specials, Who Did What in World War I, today featuring Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's biographer wrote, "Everything about Woodrow Wilson is arguable, starting with the date of his birth. He was born between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., the night of the 27th and 28th of December, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and his mother was actually British. Woodrow would be a lifelong Anglophile. He greatly admired his father, who, though known as one of the more liberal Southern religious figures, did not denounce slavery because it wasn't forbidden in the scriptures, and man could not forbid what God did not. The Civil War, the American Civil War, and the Reconstruction were the defining events of Woodrow's childhood, and seeing scenes like Jefferson Davis march through town in chains very much influenced his handling of defeated nations later in life. Obviously, the enormous racial issues in Virginia then had an impact on young Wilson, though it seems from his writing that he held a rather generic Southern view of race relations at the time. He attended Davidson College, but left for the College of New Jersey, which would later be known as Princeton. After Princeton, he went to the University of Virginia Law School, but dropped out. He then moved to Atlanta, where he worked and studied law independently and passed the bar. However, he found actually practicing law boring, and he eventually enrolled at Johns Hopkins in 1883, where he got his PhD in history and political science. Around this time, Wilson met and became engaged to Ellen Louise Axson, and they were married in 1885. They would have 3 daughters over the next few years. After his PhD, Wilson took a teaching position at the brand new Bryn Mawr College for Women, though at the time he was personally disdainful of female scholars. He next became a professor at my alma mater, Wesleyan University, and I actually lived in the house on 200 High Street where he once lived there. During this time, he was extremely productive in writing articles and books, writing over 24 articles for The Atlantic and publishing 9 books, the first of which came out in 1885 and was called Congressional Government. Wilson grew more and more interested in government administration, and his writings argued for remodeling the government more like a British parliamentary system, fusing the executive and legislative branches. He questioned the basic principles of the American government, feeling that the power and prestige of the president had declined over time and that the legislative branch now had all the power. A major milestone in his life came when he was hired to teach political economy at Princeton in 1890. Princeton, at that time, did not have the reputation for excellence it enjoys today, and was more of a playground for the wealthy. Wilson wanted to reform it and make it into a modern research university. He outlined a program for liberal arts that would combine the study of sciences with humanities. He reorganized the academic structure along German lines, and his transformative work was a big success, turning Princeton into a serious academic institution. In 1902, he became president of the university. Now, not everything he did worked as well as his academic changes. Certainly, his attempts to democratize Princeton went far less well, and in 1906, he came into open conflict with alumni when he wanted to eliminate socially exclusive clubs and residences. There were also big racial issues there. Princeton, though in New Jersey, was known as the northernmost Southern school. At one point, the Princeton football team all left the dining hall in protest when Harvard's, with 1 black player, entered. Wilson did actively discourage black people from applying for admission, but his rationale was to keep peace among white students and alumni. This era, immediately following the Spanish-American War of 1898, is often seen as the era of American imperialism, right? Wilson was not an imperialist. He believed that America's role for its colonies was to help them take care of themselves. And as the first decade of the 20th century rolled on, his opinions began to really matter. Princeton had made him visible on the political scene, and his compelling skills as a lecturer had led to people seeing him as a possible candidate for office. In fact, following a speech at a New York club in 1906, people began suggesting him as a Democratic candidate for president. But remember, at this time, only one Democrat, Grover Cleveland, had been president since before the Civil War, and that had begun nearly 50 years ago. In 1910, the Democratic Committee of New Jersey asked Wilson to run for governor of the state. He accepted, but insisted on a free hand in policy issues. The party leaders had imagined that he would be their tool. Well, he was anything but that, and even on the campaign trail, disavowed parts of the party's platform. He came out as thoroughly progressive and won the election by a landslide. New Jersey at that time was fairly corrupt, though. The law allowed corporations to own stock in other corporations, and they created trusts between railroads and other businesses, and they wielded enormous political power. Wilson immediately took on the state's political machine and initiated reforms of political parties. He introduced standards for financial disclosure and outlawed corporate contributions to political campaigns. He reformed the public utilities, provided for workmen's compensation, and passed a Corrupt Practices Act. In fact, when he became governor, he was pretty much immediately seen as presidential material with a progressive agenda. Saying that leads me to say a few words about progressivism. This was a movement at this time, across party lines, that believed the federal government needed a larger role in issues that were too big for the individual or that crossed state lines, like railroads and interstate commerce. It was a response to the excesses of the Gilded Age robber barons, and there was a widespread belief that the current economic and social conditions called for a rethinking of the Constitution and the state itself. There was a growing awareness of the women's and labor movements, and acts like the Food and Drug Act and the Federal Reserve Act were progressive actions. Wilson had firm ideas about government and business. Government must regulate business because that is the foundation of every other relationship. So, 1912. The Democratic Convention that year was the first one to use primaries to select a candidate. That candidate was Woodrow Wilson, and the presidential election was a multi-candidate race, with Wilson coming out on top of Theodore Roosevelt, current President Taft, and Eugene Debs. The public had been swayed, according to Franklin Roosevelt, by Wilson's profound social and moral convictions. But it wasn't an easy election despite divided opposition. Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt's platforms were pretty similar, actually. But Wilson won and became the first Southerner to be president since 1848. He brought in Edward House as a full-time, unpaid political advisor who was completely trusted and accountable to nobody. And major political player William Jennings Bryan, an isolationist, became Secretary of State. Wilson himself was not interested in foreign policy and once said, "It would be the irony of my fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." The major reforms of his presidency were instituting the federal income tax, establishing the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission, the National Park Service Act, and the 8-hour workday. But of course, he's remembered now as being the president during the war. On August 4th, 1914, just days after the war broke out, America declared its neutrality. And 2 days later, First Lady Ellen Wilson died of Bright's disease. Woodrow would later marry Edith Galt in December 1915. Now, we've covered both Wilson and the situation in America during the war in our America special, so I won't go into it here. But neutrality became more and more difficult to maintain, and indeed, in January 1916, the Preparedness Campaign opened paramilitary training camps in the United States, and the war was the main theme of the 1916 election. By this time, Robert Lansing was Secretary of State, and knowing of Wilson's disdain for him, he used the State Department to undermine Wilson's neutrality stance. Wilson did say, though, that if re-election depended on him getting the country into the war, then he didn't want it. The incredibly close race between Wilson and Republican Charles Evan Hughes came down to 4,000 votes in California that gave Wilson a second term. The Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, said, "No campaign in the history of this country has been so marked by viciousness, bitterness, and invective." Peace proposals, the Zimmerman Telegram, the Yarrowdale Affair, and unrestricted submarine warfare, all of which we cover in regular episodes, and all of which brought the U.S. down the path to war soon followed. And once war was declared, there were big issues, even getting the country behind the war. And the war continued, and the war ended. Wilson had famously issued his 14 points, which got a lukewarm reaction in Europe. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau said, "God was satisfied with 10 commandments. Wilson gave us 14. At the Versailles Conference in 1919, the League of Nations was formed. Wilson's efforts to establish and promote it earned him the Nobel Peace Prize that year. But the United States did not join the League. Now that will all also be covered on this channel when we reach the end of the war. And even though Wilson was important for the post-war order, he was by far not the only player. Anyhow, post-war and post-presidency, Woodrow Wilson did not live very long. He died February 3rd, 1924. His legacy as president, and especially as a progressive, is pretty strong. But what of his racial legacy? Several historians have pointed out fairly consistent examples of Wilson's racist policies and political appointments, and some say that Wilson's opposition to slavery was on economic, not moral grounds, though I cannot confirm or deny that myself. As president, his War Department drafted black men and paid them the same as whites, sure, but organized them into segregated units with white commanders. Wilson told those who complained, "Segregation is not a humiliation, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen." Civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois had campaigned for Wilson in 1912, but by 1916 opposed him, charging that his first term was the worst attempt at Jim Crow legislation and discrimination in civil service that blacks had experienced since the Civil War. But was he a great statesman and visionary who made the world safer for democracy in spite of all that? That is such a loaded question that just trying to answer it would make a whole special episode of its own. But I'm very curious what your thoughts are about one of the most controversial figures from that whole era of American history. Please keep it civil. We'd like to thank Madeline Johnson for the research for this episode. If you'd like to learn more about the U.S. before the war, you can check out our special episode about that right here. If you want to learn more about that era in the U.S., you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.